Pat Ass died the way New York taught her to live, spectacularly alone, waiting for a callback that never came. July 2001, Chelsea. The heat pressed against the windows like an impatient audience. The room smelled of Halston, champagne, and time gone stale. Around her, the ghosts of Studio 54 still danced in the mirrors, unaware the music had stopped decades ago. She had everything that made a legend, except someone left to remember her, 60 years old, once called Queen of the Night by the doorman at Studio 54. Once photographed by Richard Avedon standing between Liza Minnelli and Halston, the only one looking directly at the camera while everyone else performed joy. Once described by Andy Warhol as perfect, she's real. Now just another New York artist who died alone, her body discovered only because the landlord noticed the smell. The city roared outside, alive and loud, as if mocking the quiet inside that room. There was no breaking news. No tributes from the fashion world she had challenged. No retrospectives about the woman who had dared to be beautiful without permission. To take up space in a culture that worshipped thinness. To be Warhol's muse when muses were supposed to be waifs. The New York Times ran a brief obituary that got several details wrong. Most of her old friends from the factory days were already dead. Warhol, Basquiat, Haring, the ones who had understood her particular kind of radical existence. New York doesn't kill you, it just forgets to call you back. In her final apartment, investigators found a note tucked in her desk drawer, written in her characteristic bold handwriting. Art was the only thing that loved me back. No suicide note, no dramatic farewell, just a simple acknowledgement of what her life had taught her. That being real in a world built on fantasy was the loneliest form of fame. That breaking beauty standards meant being celebrated as novelty and discarded as soon as the novelty wore thin. Days after her death, someone found a cassette tape dated June 2001, just weeks before she died. Her voice, older but still carrying that Brooklyn bluntness that never left. Maybe being different isn't a blessing. Maybe it's just a beautiful way to be alone. She had known exactly what was coming. She had been dying this death, the death of irrelevance, of being yesterday's revolution, for over a decade. Her actual death was just the final punctuation on a sentence New York had been writing since the day Warhol died in 1987 and took her relevance with him. But to understand why Pat Ass died forgotten in a Chelsea apartment, we must first understand how she became someone worth forgetting. We must travel back to a Brooklyn where being different wasn't art yet, just stigma. The year was 1941. Brooklyn, New York, working-class streets where everyone knew everyone and conformity was survival. Patricia Ast was born into a world that had very specific ideas about what women should look like, and she would never fit any of them. By the time she was a teenager, it was clear. Pat was fat. Not pleasantly plump, not curvy in the approved ways. Fat. The kind of fat that made strangers on the subway feel entitled to comment, that made clothing stores tell her they didn't carry her size, that made her own family suggest maybe she should eat less. Could their early childhood experiences have laid the foundation for later triumphs or tragedies? For Pat, growing up fat in 1950s, Brooklyn created a specific kind of armor. She learned early that mirrors lie, so she became one. She developed a wicked sense of humor, a fuck-you confidence that masked profound pain, an ability to laugh at herself before others could laugh at her. I wasn't a beauty queen, she would later say. I was a mirror. After high school, Pat did what working-class Brooklyn girls did. She got a job. Not in fashion or entertainment. Those worlds didn't want women who looked like her. She became a receptionist at an insurance company in Manhattan, answering phones, filing paperwork, being invisible in the way fat women were expected to be invisible. Every morning she would take the subway from Brooklyn to Manhattan, watching the city transform from residential to commercial, from people to money. She hated the job but needed it. This was the early 1960s. No welfare state, no safety net, no alternatives for women without college degrees or family wealth. You worked or you starved. Pat worked, and in her spare time she explored the city that was just beginning to explode with artistic possibility. Was the success they achieved truly worth all the pain they endured? Everything changed in 1965. The story, as Pat told it, had the quality of urban legend. Too perfect to be true, too documented to be false. She was working her receptionist job when a strange man walked into the office. Silver wig, black leather jacket, pale skin, dark sunglasses even indoors. Andy Warhol, already famous, already the center of New York's avant-garde scene, looking for someone, though he'd never be able to articulate exactly what. He saw her and stopped. It wasn't beauty he found, it was truth, and that's rarer. Then he said the words that would change her life. She's perfect, she's real. Most of Warhol's superstars were beautiful in unconventional ways. Edie Sedgwick with her enormous eyes and elfin frame. Candy Darling with her transgender glamour. Nico with her icy Nordic perfection. They were challenging beauty standards by redefining them. Pat challenged beauty standards by ignoring them entirely. She was fat, unapologetically so, and in Warhol's world of artifice and performance, her realness became its own form of art. Within months, Pat had left her insurance job and entered the factory. Warhol's legendary studio space where art, drugs, sex, and fame collided in silver-painted chaos. She appeared in his films, starting with screen tests where she simply existed on camera. Her presence a statement that bodies like hers deserved to be filmed, observed, treated as art objects just like thin bodies. The factory in the late 1960s was simultaneously liberating and exploitative. On one hand, it was one of the few spaces in America where queerness, fatness, weirdness, and artistic ambition could coexist without apology. On the other hand, Warhol was a brilliant artist and a complicated person who often used people, turning their vulnerabilities into content. Was he celebrating Pat or exploiting her? The answer, as with most things Warhol, was probably both. But there was something different about how Warhol saw Pat compared to his other superstars. Edie Sedgwick was tragic beauty, doomed and ethereal. Candy Darling was fantasy made flesh, a woman who invented herself. Pat was real in a way that made the others look like performances. She didn't have to try to be interesting, she just had to exist, and existence itself became the art. In the factory hierarchy, Pat occupied a unique position. She wasn't the drugged-out waif or the glamorous diva. She was the grounding force, the person who remembered to eat, who kept her Brooklyn apartment even as others crashed on the factory floor. Other superstars burned bright and fast. Pat burned steady, which is perhaps why she lasted longer, and why lasting longer meant watching everyone else disappear. She worked on multiple Warhol projects throughout the early 1970s. Small roles, experimental films, the kind of work that would be canonized decades later but meant little commercially at the time. She understood this. Andy makes art, she told a friend. The rest of us just try to survive being in it. Pat navigated this world with her trademark humor and resilience. While other factory superstars imploded on drugs and desperation, Pat kept her feet on the ground. She still lived in her modest Brooklyn apartment. She still took the subway. She didn't do heroin or pills, marijuana occasionally, alcohol at parties, but nothing that would compromise her ability to survive. She had seen what happened to Edie, to Candy, to the ones who believed the factory was real life. She knew better. The factory was performance, and when the performance ended, you needed somewhere to go home to. In 1972, Pat starred in Heat, one of Warhol's feature films directed by Paul Morrissey. She played a former actress living in a rundown Hollywood motel, desperate for a comeback that would never come. The role was devastatingly prescient. Pat was essentially playing her own future. Critics called her performance the Marilyn Monroe version of Truth. She played a faded actress with the kind of raw honesty that made audiences uncomfortable. The film premiered to mixed reviews. Art critics loved it. Mainstream audiences didn't know what to make of it. Pat's performance was too real, too unflinching in its portrayal of a woman whose body and age had made her unmarketable. Hollywood distributors barely promoted it. It should have been her breakthrough. Instead, it became evidence of the limits of America's willingness to embrace unconventional bodies on screen. Pat understood what was happening. "They loved me when I was Warhol's curiosity," she said in an interview after the film's release. "But they don't want to see me as the lead. They want me as the joke, not the story." She wasn't bitter when she said it, just clear-eyed about the industry's calculations. A fat woman could be art in an experimental film, but a fat woman as romantic lead, as complex character, as someone audiences were meant to identify with rather than observe, that was too much. Still, Heat gave her something, proof that she could act, that her presence on screen was more than novelty. Directors who worked with her praised her naturalism, her ability to inhabit a character without disappearing into it. But praise doesn't pay rent, and naturalism wasn't what Hollywood wanted in the 1970s. They wanted spectacle, and Pat's spectacle, her body, her realness, was only valuable in controlled doses filtered through Warhol's aesthetic distance. Behind all that confidence, was there an unbearable loneliness that nobody saw? By the mid-1970s, Pat had become a fixture in New York's cultural scene. She was part of Warhol's inner circle, attending parties at Studio 54 alongside Liza Minnelli, Halston, Bianca Jagger, the people who defined glamour in that era. Her relationship with designer Halston was particularly significant. Halston, who usually dressed impossibly thin models, the Angelica Houstons and Pat Clevelands of the world, began creating custom pieces for Pat. This wasn't charity. Halston understood that fashion was inherently political, that every body dressed was a statement about whose body mattered. Making couture for Pat was his way of saying, "This body matters too." The first time Pat wore Halston on a red carpet, photographers didn't know where to look. Here was a fat woman in haute couture, not as a gimmick or a statement piece, but as a client, as someone who belonged in that space. Fashion magazines ran the photos but framed them as curiosities. Designer Halston's unexpected muse, rather than simply showing a well-dressed woman. Pat saw through this. "They're congratulating Halston for dressing me," she noted, "as if clothing my body was an act of bravery instead of just fashion." But she wore the clothes anyway, beautifully and unapologetically. Every appearance in Halston became a small revolution, proof that fat women could inhabit high fashion without apology or explanation. Years later, when body positivity advocates would trace the history of plus-size representation in fashion, they would point to Pat Aston Halston as a pivotal moment, though Pat herself never saw the recognition. At Studio 54, she was queen of the night. The doorman knew her, celebrities knew her. She could walk past the line and into the pulsing darkness where disco music and cocaine and champagne mixed into a kind of secular religion. A typical night at Studio 54 went like this. Pat would arrive around midnight when the crowd was thick and the energy was building. She'd wear Halston, always Halston, something bold and architectural that transformed her body into sculpture. The doorman would wave her through without hesitation. Inside, the music hit like a physical force, bass frequencies that vibrated in your chest, lights that turned everyone beautiful. She would dance. Not self-consciously, not performing, just dancing because the music demanded it. People would orbit around her, curious, attracted to the confidence she projected, the way she occupied space without apology. Photographers would circle, capturing images that would appear in magazines the next week. Pat asked, larger than life, laughing with Liza or sharing a cigarette with Halston, always present, always visible. But visibility isn't the same as being seen. Between songs in the bathroom and quiet moments at the bar, Pat would watch the younger crowd, the beautiful boys and gorgeous girls who looked like they had been sculpted rather than born. She would see how easily they moved through the world, how their beauty opened doors she had to kick down. She would think about going home to Brooklyn, to her small apartment where nobody was watching, where she could stop performing confidence and just be tired. Every night she was worshipped under artificial lights, and every morning she woke under real ones. The contradiction never resolved. Studio 54 made her famous, gave her visibility and validation. But it was a specific kind of visibility, the freak show kind, where people celebrated her for being different while maintaining enough distance that different didn't threaten their own normalcy. She was allowed to be the exception as long as she didn't demand to become the rule. But every night ended. The lights came up. The music stopped. And Pat would take a cab back to Brooklyn, back to her small apartment, back to the realization that being celebrated at Studio 54 didn't mean being accepted in America. During the day, she still couldn't find clothes in regular stores. She still got stared at on the subway. She still lived a split existence. Goddess at night, freak during the day. She started recording sounds of the city on cassette tapes, a habit she would maintain for decades. The breathing of New York, she called it. Traffic noise, rain on pavement, subway doors closing, snippets of overheard conversations. She would label each tape meticulously with date and location, creating an audio archive of the city she loved and that loved her back only conditionally. The ritual became essential. Every few days, Pat would take her tape recorder and microphone, equipment left over from an abandoned art project in the 1980s, and go out into the city at odd hours. 3 a.m. on 14th Street, recording the traffic and the late-night diners and the sounds of delivery trucks. Rainy afternoons in the village, capturing the specific acoustics of wet pavement and umbrella-muted conversations. Sunday mornings when the city was briefly quiet before the tourists and the workers flooded back in. She wasn't trying to make art, though the tapes were more artistic than many things galleries were showing. She was trying to prove she still existed, that she was still connected to New York even as New York forgot her. Every cassette was evidence. I was here. I heard this. I mattered enough to witness. I mattered enough. In her apartment, the tapes accumulated, hundreds of them shelved chronologically, each one a timestamp of a city constantly erasing its own history. Pat knew she was documenting something that would disappear, that her New York, the factory New York, the Studio 54 New York, the New York where weirdness was currency, was already gone. These tapes were her way of saying, it happened, we were real. Even if nobody remembers, the sound remains. Did this tragic event mark their downfall? Or was it simply the tipping point of deeper problems? The beginning of the end came on February 22, 1987, when Andy Warhol died from complications following routine gallbladder surgery. He was 58. Pat was 46. The news hit the factory circle like a bomb. When Andy died, she didn't lose a friend, she lost her reflection. Pat felt it immediately. The phone stopped ringing as frequently. Party invitations became sporadic. The art galleries that had courted her for Warhol-related projects lost interest. Fashion designers who had dressed her because it pleased Warhol suddenly had other priorities. The message was clear. You were interesting when you were Andy's muse. Now you're just fat. They want muses that don't age, she wrote in her diary in 1994. I aged, so they found a new one. The muse outlived the myth, and that was her curse. The 1990s were brutal for Pat. The culture was shifting away from the anything-goes experimentation of the 1970s toward a new conformity dressed up as rebellion. Heroin chic dominated fashion, models so thin they looked skeletal. The body positivity movement hadn't been invented yet. Being fat wasn't a political statement, it was just being fat, and the world had no use for it. She took whatever work she could find. Small theater productions where she played character roles, the funny neighbor, the wise older woman, parts that used her size for comedy rather than humanity. Voiceover work for commercials, her distinctive voice selling products she couldn't afford to buy. Teaching occasional workshops about the factory years to college students who saw that era as ancient history, who couldn't imagine that the fat woman standing before them had once been photographed by Avedon and dressed by Halston. The administrative jobs returned full circle back to where she started. Except now she had memories of better days to haunt her. She worked as a receptionist again at a real estate office in Chelsea. The irony wasn't lost on her, back to answering phones and filing papers, except this time she was doing it in the neighborhood where art had once happened, where her friends had once made history. Now that neighborhood was gentrifying, becoming expensive, pushing out the artists and freaks who had made it interesting in the first place. On her lunch breaks, she would walk past galleries that no longer showed work like hers, past restaurants she could no longer afford, past stores selling vintage Warhol merchandise, her face occasionally visible in old photographs, uncredited and unrecognized. She was living in her own past, ghosting through a city that had moved on without her. Can anyone ever truly escape from the shadow of their darkest moments? For Pat, the darkest moment wasn't a single event, but a slow dimming. Watching her friends die, first Warhol, then Basquiat in 1988, then Haring in 1990. The three men who had understood her particular genius, who had seen her as art rather than aberration, all gone before she turned 50. She became the last witness to a world that no longer existed, and nobody particularly wanted to hear her testimony. She befriended Keith Haring and Jean-Michel Basquiat before they died, drawn to their energy, their refusal to conform, their understanding that art could be a form of survival. She called them the children who understood my madness. When they died young, Basquiat at 27 from an overdose, Haring at 31 from AIDS complications, Pat grieved not just for them but for what their deaths represented. The consumption and disposal of artists who dared to be different. "This city eats its saints," she said in a 1990 interview, her voice heavy with knowledge. "If they ever find me dead, don't be surprised. Were these final decisions acts of surrender or courageous acts of self-preservation?" In her final decade, Pat retreated from public life almost entirely. Not because she wanted to, but because public life had retreated from her first. The few interviews she gave in the late 1990s show a woman trying to make peace with irrelevance while maintaining dignity. She was honest about her disappointment but refused self-pity. She didn't want immortality. She just wanted to matter while she was still alive. She cooked elaborate meals for herself in her small kitchen. She wore vintage Halston dresses around her apartment even though no one was watching. She listened to old disco records and recorded the sounds of the city that was changing around her. She lived alone. She had never married, never had children. Choices that felt liberating in the 1970s but left her isolated in the 2000s when everyone from that era was either dead or had moved on to conventional lives. Her family in Brooklyn had never understood her life in Manhattan, and the distance between boroughs became unbridgeable. She was too weird for straight society, too old for the new generation of artists, too much herself to fit anywhere comfortably. In one of her last cassette recordings made just weeks before her death, she spoke directly into the microphone as if addressing a future listener. "People loved my body on camera but not on the couch. They wanted me as an idea, not as a person. And maybe that's all any of us are to this city, ideas that become inconvenient when they demand to be fed, housed, remembered." On a July day in 2001, Pat Ast died in her Chelsea apartment. The exact cause remains somewhat unclear. Heart failure possibly, or complications from diabetes. What's certain is that she died alone, and several days passed before anyone noticed. The landlord, concerned about unpaid rent and a smell from the apartment, called the police. They found her surrounded by the artifacts of her life: photographs from Studio 54, cassette tapes of city sounds, Halston dresses still carefully preserved, a diary full of observations about beauty and loneliness and the cost of being real. Was their death as straightforward as reported? Or were powerful hidden forces involved? In Pat's case, there was no conspiracy, no suspicious circumstances. Her death was exactly what it appeared to be: a woman dying alone in New York City, one of thousands who die this way every year. But that straightforward explanation shouldn't obscure the real tragedy, which isn't how she died, but how she was forgotten long before death found her. The tragedy of Pat Ast is the tragedy of being ahead of your time without living long enough to see your time arrive. She challenged beauty standards in the 1970s, decades before body positivity became a movement. She insisted on taking up space, on being visible, on treating her fat body as worthy of art and fashion and desire. She was right. But being right doesn't pay rent. Being right doesn't prevent loneliness. Being right doesn't make the phone ring when everyone who valued your rightness is dead. What hidden secrets might still remain untold behind their public image? In the years after Pat's death, something interesting happened. The culture began slowly to catch up to where she had been decades earlier. The body positivity movement gained momentum. Plus-size models appeared on magazine covers. Designers created fashion for bodies that looked like Pat's. Young activists talked about fat phobia and size discrimination using language that didn't exist when Pat was fighting these battles alone. Many of these activists had never heard of Pat Ast. Those who had tended to know her as one of Warhol's people, a footnote in someone else's story. But among a small group of fashion historians and body positivity advocates, Pat began to be recognized as a pioneer. They called her Mother of Real Fashion, acknowledged that she had laid groundwork that others built upon. But Pat never saw this recognition. She died in 2001, just a few years too early to witness the cultural shift she had helped create. She died believing that her difference had been tolerated as novelty but never actually accepted. She died thinking she had failed to change anything. There's a famous photograph from Studio 54 taken by Richard Avedon in 1978. Pat stands in the center holding a champagne flute, flanked by Liza Minnelli and Halston. Everyone is laughing except Pat, who looks directly at the camera with an expression that's hard to read. Is it sadness? Knowing? A kind of prophetic awareness? Avedon later said, "She knew the lights would go out soon. You can see it in her eyes." That photograph has been reproduced countless times since Pat's death, appearing in documentaries about Studio 54, books about Warhol, retrospectives about 1970s New York. Every time it appears, people stop to look at the fat woman in the Halston dress, standing among legends, looking like she knows something the others don't. They're drawn to that expression, to the mystery of what she's thinking in that moment. What she was thinking probably was this: these lights are temporary. This acceptance is conditional. And when the party ends, I'll be exactly who I was before. A fat woman from Brooklyn whom the world barely tolerates. She was right, of course. She usually was. The question that haunts Pat Ast's story is whether her life was triumph or tragedy. She broke barriers, appeared in important films, was photographed by legendary photographers, wore haute couture, danced at Studio 54, was called a queen. By any standard measure, she succeeded. She made herself matter in a world that told her she didn't. But she also died alone and forgotten. Her body undiscovered for days, her death barely noted by the culture she had helped define. She spent her final years in obscurity, working jobs she was overqualified for, watching from the margins as the world moved on without her. By that measure, she failed, or rather the world failed her. Perhaps the truth is that Pat Ast's life was both. Triumph and tragedy aren't opposites. They're often the same story told from different angles. She triumphed by living authentically in a culture that demanded conformity. She suffered tragedy because living authentically doesn't protect you from dying alone. I wasn't a beauty queen, she said. I was a mirror. That's exactly what she was. A mirror that reflected back truths people didn't want to see. That fat women could be beautiful. That art could come from bodies deemed unworthy. That taking up space was a political act. That the factory and Studio 54 and all of New York's legendary spaces were built on the labor and lives of people who would be discarded once their novelty faded. The mirror showed all of this, but mirrors don't protect themselves. They shatter when dropped, and nobody notices until they need to check their reflection and find only broken glass. In her Chelsea apartment, among her final possessions, investigators found dozens of cassette tapes meticulously labeled and organized. The breathing of New York, she had called them. The last tape was dated June 15, 2001, just weeks before her death. On it, recorded in the middle of the night, is the sound of rain on the Chelsea streets, sirens in the distance, someone laughing outside a bar, a dog barking, the rumble of a garbage truck. And underneath it all, barely audible, Pat's voice. This city keeps breathing even when we stop. She waited for a call that never came. But maybe the city answered, in sirens, in rain, in the sound of itself still breathing. Can beauty that breaks all the rules ever truly be celebrated? Or is it only tolerated until it becomes inconvenient? And what does it mean to be real in a world that treats reality as the ultimate transgression? Pat Ast's story doesn't offer easy answers. She wasn't a saint. She could be difficult, demanding, sharp-tongued when hurt. She wasn't a victim. She chose her path knowing the costs. She was simply a fat woman from Brooklyn who dared to believe she deserved to be seen, celebrated, remembered. She was right about deserving these things. But deserving and receiving are different words for a reason. Today, when plus-size models walk runways and appear on magazine covers, when body positivity is a hashtag and a movement, when fat women can buy designer clothes and see themselves represented in media, when all these things that Pat fought for have started to become normal, her name is rarely mentioned. The revolution she helped start has largely forgotten its soldiers, but revolutions are like that. They consume their architects and celebrate only the structures left behind. Pat Ast was consumed. What remains is the possibility she created, that bodies like hers could exist in spaces of beauty and art. That size could be irrelevant to worthiness, that taking up space was not an apology but an assertion. She died alone in Chelsea, but she didn't die empty. She had filled her life with sound, the city's breathing captured on tape. She had filled her life with beauty, the Halston dresses, the photographs, the memories of nights when she was queen. She had filled her life with truth, even when truth guaranteed loneliness. The man is gone. The woman is gone, but the mirror remains. And what it shows us, if we're brave enough to look, is that being real in an artificial world is the most radical act possible, and the loneliest. Pat Ast knew this from the beginning. She lived it until the end. And when the city finally stopped breathing in her apartment on that July day, she had already recorded everything she needed to say. Art was the only thing that loved me back. New York doesn't kill you, it just forgets to call you back. Maybe being different isn't a blessing. Maybe it's just a beautiful way to be alone. These were her truths, spoken in different moments, in different contexts, but all arriving at the same conclusion. That visibility doesn't guarantee love, that breaking barriers doesn't prevent loneliness, that being ahead of your time means dying before your time comes. The last people to see Pat alive were strangers. A bodega clerk, a neighbor in passing. The first people to see her dead were also strangers. Police officers, paramedics, people doing their jobs. In between these two moments, she died alone, which is how most prophets die, isolated by the truth they insisted on speaking. But prophets don't need to be believed to be right. They just need to speak. Pat Ast spoke loudly and clearly for as long as anyone would listen and longer still after they stopped. She spoke with her body, with her presence, with her refusal to disappear even when disappearing would have been easier, safer, more comfortable for everyone else. She spoke, and some of us are still listening. Not enough of us, perhaps, not as many as she deserved, but enough to know that she mattered, that her life meant something, that the mirror she held up showed truths we still need to face. The city keeps breathing even when we stop. And Pat Ast's breath, recorded on cassette tapes and preserved in photographs and captured in films, is still part of that breathing, still part of New York's endless conversation with itself, still part of the story we tell about who gets to be beautiful, who gets to be remembered, who gets to matter. She got her answer to those questions. It wasn't the answer she wanted, but it was honest, which is all she ever asked for. Honesty about the cost of being real, the price of being different, the wages of refusing to conform. The mirror broke when she died, but we can still see ourselves in the pieces. Maybe being different isn't a blessing. Maybe it's just a beautiful way to be alone.